Environment economics analyzes various environmental problems, like, for instance, global warming due to man-made greenhouse gas emissions. In environment economics, we use the normal traditional tools of micro and macroeconomics, but also we include the newest insight, for instance, from political sciences and psychology. I'm well aware that there are some critics that actually say environment economics should not contribute to solving environmental problems because we are the cause of the problem. Probably they think economics is only about money making, but in this video I'd like to convince you that we are rather serious and can make a significant contribution to solve environmental problems. As most environmental problems are man-made, it seems natural that social sciences like sociology, political sciences, and of course economics make a contribution in solving these problems. We basically start from the point where natural scientists have identified an environmental problem. A central starting point or premises in economics is a scarcity of resources. Basically, we ask the question, how should we allocate scarce resources such that welfare, or call it well-being, of people is maximized? In economics, we always realize that there's a trade-off, or as we say, there's no such thing than a free lunch. For instance, economic growth goes along with higher energy consumption. There's also a clear trade-off between different energy sources. For instance, if you use less oil, you have to use more gas or other energy sources like wind or solar power. In order to evaluate these trade-offs, economics typically puts a monetary value on natural assets. This is not because we believe that everything should be monetized, but simply, if you want to make a rational decision, you have to express benefits and cost in the same units. Because market goods are anyway priced, we think it's natural that we also do that for natural assets. Another central concept is how people react to incentives and how policy should be designed to activate these incentives. For instance, if public transport is rather cheap, people will be more inclined to use public transport. Of course, there is clear evidence that people are not only reacting to price incentives. Intrinsic motivation to care for the environment or social norms or acquired habits also play a crucial role how people behave. It is for this reason that modern economics also includes new insights from psychologists or from neuroscientists. Finally, the well-being of people crucially depends on the consumption and production of goods, so certainly not exclusively. So it seems rather natural that economics is also involved when we talk about green growth or sustainable growth.
The UK has come a long way in the last 35 or so years in terms of its recycling rate. In the 1980s it was just under 1% and currently it's 40%. The target for 2020 under the EU directive, landfill directive, is 50% of recycling. We observed that there was, in terms of Bath, a high level of recycling done, whereas in other areas, like for instance in certain boroughs in London, there are very low rates of recycling. And so we just came up with a question, why is that the case? And we found that there was an inverse relationship between the recycling rate and the frequency of bin collection. Or that is, if you reduce the number of times your bin is collected, you will increase the recycling rate. And I suppose our intuitive explanation of that is that people have to think more carefully about their waste if the bin man comes less frequently, and possibly think about what is recyclable, because otherwise they'll just have more and more waste accumulating in their dwelling. And that was a very important finding at the time because it coincided with the release of the government waste review in 2011, where the coalition government decided to reverse the previous Labour policy, which was to reduce the frequency of bin collection. And the coalition government wanted to go back to a weekly collection. So therefore our research would suggest that if you do that, a possible consequence could be a reduction in the recycling rate. From that, because in the UK local authorities are not allowed to charge for their waste or subsidise for recycling, we decided to investigate human behaviour in more depth. And this brings us a little bit into the field of psychology. But it's still firmly embedded, in my opinion, within economics, because it's all about incentives and using non-price measures to try and manipulate people's behaviour. And manipulate is probably the wrong word because it has bad connotations, but try and nudge them in the right direction in terms of public good. So what's good for all? So individually you might not be motivated to do something, but if everybody did a small bit in terms of the environment, then the overall effect would be beneficial for everybody. So that's what you're trying to do, is just nudge people in the right direction. So we wanted to investigate whether there was a social norm to recycle, and we found that there was. And we investigated the social norm in different dimensions. So do you behave like people of similar age? Do you behave like people of similar ethnicity? Or do you behave like your neighbours? Or people who are educated similarly to you or in the same income bracket. And of those 5, we found that age, ethnicity and locality were the most important. And it might point to the fact that social norms provide information to people on how to behave, as well as a value judgment. So social norms have 2 aspects. One would be information, but the other might be a value judgment. You want to do what others expect you to do, because it's deemed to be the right thing to do. But you know, at a more basic level, you want to do what others do because you're taking a cue as that is the correct thing to do. And all this is important from a policy point of view, because the government, instead of using taxes and subsidies to manipulate people's behaviour in a hard way, if you like, so by affecting the money in their pocket, you might like to do it in a more nudging way and more information, and see how information affects their behaviour. And the government is in fact moving towards that, because they have set up a department, a cabinet office within government, particularly looking at behavioural insights into public policy.
Water scarcity is one of the biggest environmental issues of our century, and it's mainly because we don't have enough water to meet all our future economic requirements. And it's going to get worse because of climate change, which not only reduces water availability, but it also increases our demand for water. And so the way I went about looking at this problem at the University of Bath was looking into water pricing techniques and privatizations, which were advocated as one of the best economic solutions to water scarcity. And this took me to my current research that I do at FEAM, Climate Change Research Institute. And I'm working particularly on a project in the Caribbean islands that looks at adaptation strategies in climate change, particularly in the water sector. Now, small island states in the Caribbean are very water scarce because they're too small to enable sufficient water capture, and they're also, because of their geographical location, they're more vulnerable to climate change threats, such as increased hurricanes or dryness or increased heat. So we went about looking at the past 50, 60 years of research, and we noticed that all the solutions that had been suggested were never really implemented, and we noticed there was a mismatch between the solutions that were suggested and the capabilities that each individual country had to actually implement those. And so what we came up with was we developed a framework which forms part of a vulnerability analysis that is able to both analyze things like the cost effectiveness of individual solutions, but also at the financial capabilities, government capabilities and technical capabilities of each country, and match them in order for us to have more practical, realistic and more useful solutions. And this forms part of a wider global effort to help small island states all over the world improve their policy making and the suggestions we give in order for them to meet their future water requirements, but also for them to tackle the climate change threats that they will have in the future.
A project I'm currently working on is on the discounting of the future. Discounting is used in economics to evaluate the cost and benefits that accrue at a different point in time. Essentially what we do is we put a weight on the benefits now and the costs now, and also a weight on the future benefits and costs. And what happens is the more we discount time, the more impatient we are, the less weight we give to benefits and costs in the future. And this is quite crucial in climate change, because if you discount time a lot, you come to the conclusion that you should hardly do any climate change action. The reason is simple. If you reduce emissions now, you occur cost now, whereas the benefits in the form of reduced damages will occur in the future. Basically, there are two camps in economics. The one camp I would call the positivist or mainstream economist that argue that the choice of the discount rate should be value-free. For that reason, they recommend that we should observe market interest rates and take them as the discount rate because they already reflect the preferences of people. If you follow their prescription, it basically means that we choose a discount rate between 4 and 7%, and that basically means that we should do rather little to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions because the benefits of reduced damages that occur in the future are receiving a very small weight. There's the other camp, which I call the normativist or ecologist, that argue that we should choose a discount rate rather close to zero because we cannot use market interest rates. Here we talk about a problem of huge social dimension and it involves future generations, and they think we should put a high weight on the interest also of future generations. Following their prescription, you come to a completely different conclusion. You should follow a much more aggressive climate change policy and reduce emissions now. With colleagues at the Department of Political Sciences, we want to analyze the discounting issue. In particular, we are interested, what are the implicit and explicit assumptions around climate change and discounting? We have in particular an interest to discuss all these arguments in a non-technical way so that they are also accessible to the wider public. Because we believe that also the wider public should have a stake in the climate change debate. Another project is about the design of future climate change treaties. What we need is desperately international policy coordination and cooperation. The big problem is, however, that there is no international law that actually could enforce these treaties. For instance, if we look at the Kyoto Protocol that was signed in 1997, it only aimed at a very, very modest emission reduction of 5%, and it was only ratified by 36 countries. So this clearly shows that it's not that easy to enforce a treaty. But if you look at the newest scientific evidence from climatologists, which basically suggests that the climate change problem is probably much more serious than originally estimated, then we need a new climate treaty. All efforts that we have seen in the past to negotiate a new climate treaty, however, clearly have failed, which is a very, very sad story. Our research at the University of Bath is trying to suggest solutions out of this dilemma. We try to capture the different interests of governments using a method that is called game theory, which captures the strategic interaction among different governments. For instance, we addressed the question whether it would be more sensible that a small group of countries goes for an ambitious abatement treaty, or alternatively, if you have a large group of countries that tries to implement kind of a consensus treaty, that means compromising on environmental targets but having a large participation. Our research clearly indicates that faced with a trade-off between, on the one hand, a consensus treaty and an ambitious treaty, we should go for the consensus treaty. This might be not very good news to all those that think that climate change is happening and we are addressing the problem much too slow. Another question we addressed is that in the light of extremely diverse countries worldwide, should we follow the current negotiation strategies to get all countries into one treaty? Or should we alternatively allow them to sign separate treaties. What we found is that as long as we have no chance to have a comprehensive treaty in place, it might be really worthwhile to consider having several treaties among countries that have some common interests. For example, they are close to each other geographically, or they are similar in terms of their stage of development, or any other interest we can think of that ties them together. The interesting thing is that our results are well in line with other evidence we find in other policy areas. For instance, international trade negotiations to reduce trade barriers. There, it was also that for a long time they tried to negotiate a comprehensive treaty. They failed and then eventually realized that it's much better having regional and bilateral treaties. I hope the examples made it clear that environmental economics is a very powerful tool in addressing environmental problems. In particular, I believe that economics is very useful. It uses mathematical models to formalize ideas in a very rigorous way. So all assumptions are transparent, which is important if you want to have a lively scientific debate. It is clear the environmental problems we currently face are huge. We at the economics department at the University of Bath are keen to make a significant contribution in addressing and solving these problems. So after all, it's very important to build a sustainable future for future generations to come.